The first snowfall of the season always had a way of making everything feel new again. In a small, quiet town surrounded by snowy hills and tall pine trees, winter arrived like an old friend who never forgot to visit. The air turned crisp, the mornings sparkled with frost, and the world seemed to hush under a thick blanket of white. People bundled up in their warmest coats, kids rushed outside to build snowmen, and chimneys began puffing out curls of smoke as fires crackled indoors. In one corner of the town, there lived a young woman who spent most of her days alone. She wasn't shy or unfriendly, just someone who preferred solitude over crowds. Her name didn't matter much to anyone except herself. What mattered was the music she made. Music had been her companion for as long as she could remember. It filled the empty spaces when words failed and gave voice to emotions that were too big to explain. But lately, life had pulled her away from the piano. Bills needed paying, responsibilities piled up, and somewhere along the way, her passion took a back seat. That evening, as the snow fell softly outside her window, she found herself staring at her old piano. It sat in the corner of her cozy cabin, its surface dusty but familiar. The keys looked worn, each one bearing the marks of countless songs played over the years. Sitting down on the bench, she ran her fingers lightly across them, feeling the cool smoothness beneath her skin. For a moment, she hesitated. What if she couldn't play like before? What if the magic was gone? But then something inside her shifted. Maybe it was the sight of the snow falling silently outside. Or maybe it was the memory of sitting right here, as a child, watching her grandmother's hands glide effortlessly over the same keys. Whatever it was, she decided to try. Slowly, tentatively, she pressed down on the first key. A single note rang out, clear and pure, slicing through the stillness of the room. Encouraged, she added another note, then another, until a simple melody began to take shape. As she played, memories came flooding back. Of family gatherings where everyone squeezed into the tiny living room to listen. Of laughter mixed with clinking teacups. Of her grandmother humming softly while turning the pages of sheet music. Those moments felt so far away now, almost like they belonged to someone else's life. Yet here she was, reconnecting with a part of herself she thought she'd lost. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the world beyond her window. Inside, the music grew louder, filling the cabin with warmth and nostalgia. Each note carried a piece of her, a fragment of joy, a shard of sadness, a whisper of hope. She didn't know it yet, but this impromptu session would set off a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the lives of those around her too. Little did she realize that this quiet night, with nothing but the snow and her piano for company, would become the beginning of something extraordinary. The next morning, the town woke up to a fresh layer of snow that sparkled like tiny diamonds under the pale winter sun. Life went on as usual. Kids trudged to school, shopkeepers swept their doorsteps clear of snow, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafted from the local bakery. But inside the cozy cabin, things were different. The pie. Woman who lived there couldn't stop thinking about the music she had played the night before. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it felt real in a way nothing else had for years. That afternoon, while tidying up her grandmother's old bookshelf, she stumbled upon something unexpected. Tucked between two dusty novels was a thin folder, its edges yellowed with age. Curious, she pulled it out and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in faded handwriting, notes scrawled hastily, with little arrows pointing this way and that. At the top of the page, written in bold letters, were the words, "Winter Reverie." Her heart skipped a beat. She remembered this piece vaguely from her childhood. Her grandmother used to talk about it sometimes, calling it her unfinished symphony. Back then, she had thought it was just another story her grandmother liked to tell, a whimsical tale meant to entertain. But now, holding the fragile sheet of paper in her hands, she realized how much it meant. This was more than just an incomplete song. It was a piece of her grandmother's soul, left behind unfinished. She sat down at the piano, placing the sheet of music on the stand. The notes stared back at her, both inviting and intimidating. Could she really do this? Could she pick up where her grandmother had left off and bring this melody to life? Doubt crept in, whispering that she wasn't good enough, that she should leave well enough alone. But something deeper, a quiet determination she hadn't felt in years, pushed her forward. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. Taking a deep breath, she began to play. At first, the melody sounded hesitant, unsure of itself. Some parts were easy to follow, almost instinctive, while others felt disjointed, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Still, she kept going, letting the music guide her. Each note brought her closer to understanding what her grandmother might have envisioned all those years ago. As she played, memories surfaced unbidden, her grandmother sitting beside her, patiently, explaining how to read sheet music. The sound of her laughter filling the room during holiday gatherings. The way her eyes lit up whenever someone complimented her playing. These weren't just fragments of the past. They were threads, weaving together a tapestry of love and connection. And suddenly, finishing this piece didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a gift. By the time evening rolled around, her fingers ached, and the candle on the piano had burned down to a stub. But she didn't mind. For the first time in ages, she felt alive, not just existing, but truly living. There was still so much work to be done, so many gaps to fill, but she could already hear the faint outline of something beautiful taking shape, something that would honor her grandmother's memory, and maybe even touch the hearts of others. Little did she know, her journey with Winter Reverie was only beginning. What started as a personal quest to reconnect with her roots would soon ripple outward, touching lives in ways she never imagined. All because one snowy afternoon, she decided to dust off an old piece of music and let it lead her somewhere new. The days turned into weeks, and the woman threw herself into the music with a quiet intensity that surprised even her. Every evening, after the world outside grew dark and silent, she would sit at the piano, the sheet of Winter Reverie propped up on the stand, like an old friend who had seen better days. The notes came easier now, but they still carried challenges, little gaps where her grandmother's handwriting faltered or smudged, places where the melody seemed to trail off into uncertainty. It was like piecing together a story with missing chapters, and sometimes it felt impossible to guess what came next. But there was something about those late-night sessions that kept her going. Maybe it was the way the candlelight flickered across, the keys, casting shadows that danced in time with the music. Or maybe it was the comforting creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet, reminding her that this cabin, this piano, this life, it was all hers. Whatever it was, she found herself looking forward to these hours alone, when the rest of the world seemed to fade away, and it was just her and the music. One particularly cold night, as frost painted delicate patterns on the windows, she hit a snag. A section of the piece refused to come together no matter how hard she tried. She played it over and over, tweaking a note here, adjusting the rhythm there, but nothing felt right. Frustrated, she leaned back on the bench and sighed, rubbing her temples. The room was so quiet she could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, from somewhere outside, came the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. She froze, startled. Who would be out here at this hour? Peering through the window, she saw a small figure standing near her front door, bundled up in a thick coat and scarf, cheeks red from the cold. It was a boy, no older than 8 or 9, his breath visible in little puffs as he hesitated, clearly unsure whether to knock or turn back. Curiosity got the better of her. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she opened the door. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice gentle but cautious. The boy looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mix found awe and nervousness. "I heard you playing," he said softly, almost shyly. "It sounded Nice. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. No one had ever sought her out because of her music before. Sure, people in town knew she played the piano, but they usually kept their distance, assuming she preferred solitude. Yet here was this child, standing in the freezing cold, drawn to her melodies, like a moth to a flame. "Well, thank you," she replied finally, smiling despite herself. "Would you like to come in and listen for a bit?" The boy nodded eagerly, brushing snow off his boots before stepping inside. She offered him a seat near the fire, wrapped him in a blanket, and returned to the piano. As she began to play again, she noticed something remarkable. The boy listened with rapt attention, his face lighting up with every swell of the melody. When the final note faded, he clapped his hands enthusiastically, grinning from ear to ear. "You're really good," he exclaimed. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Her heart swelled with warmth. For years, she had thought of her music as something private, something meant only for herself. But seeing the joy it brought to this child made her realize it could mean more. That night, as she watched him trudge back home through the snow, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about finishing her grandmother's piece anymore. It was about sharing it, letting it touch others in ways she hadn't anticipated. And so, without realizing it, she began to open her door a little wider, not just to the boy, but to the possibility that her music might have a place in the world beyond her cozy cabin. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when something unusual happens. It wasn't long before the boy started talking about the magical music he'd heard at the woman's cabin. At first, it was just his family who listened. His parents smiled politely, thinking it was just a child's excitement over something new. But then the boy brought his best friend along one evening, and the two of them stood outside her door, knocking timidly. She opened it to find them bundled up against the cold, their eyes wide with anticipation. "Can we listen again?" The boy asked, clutching a thermos of hot chocolate his mum had sent along. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she was ready to share her private world with more people. But there was something so earnest about their request, so full of hope, that she couldn't say no. "Of course," she said finally, stepping aside to let them in. The boys sat quietly by the fire, sipping their hot chocolate as she played. By the end of the piece, they were grinning from ear to ear, clapping enthusiastically. The next night, there were 3 children waiting outside her door, then 5, then 10. Soon it wasn't just kids anymore. Parents began tagging along, curious to hear what all the fuss was about. Some brought snacks, others carried blankets to sit on. And before she knew it, her tiny cabin was filled with the hum of voices and laughter. For someone who had spent years keeping to herself, it was overwhelming, but also strangely wonderful. At first, she worried about losing control of her space. Her cozy evenings at the piano had been her sanctuary, a place where she could pour her heart into the music without judgment. Now strangers were showing up uninvited, sitting inches away from her as she played. What if they didn't like it? What if they thought she wasn't good enough? But those fears melted away the first time she looked up mid-performance and saw the faces of her audience. There was an elderly man with tears streaming down his cheeks, nodding slowly to the rhythm. A young mother held her baby close, rocking gently as the melody wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Even the teenagers, who usually seemed glued to their phones, sat silently, completely absorbed. In that moment, she realized her music wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who found comfort in it. As the weeks went by, the gatherings became a nightly ritual. People would gather outside her cabin, stamping their feet to keep warm, chatting quietly until she began to play. Then, as the first note rang out, the chatter would fade, replaced by an almost sacred silence. Each performance felt like a gift, not just for her listeners, but for her too. She noticed how the music changed depending on the mood of the crowd. Sometimes soft and reflective, other times lively and joyful. It was as if the melodies responded to the energy of the room, growing richer with every shared moment. The boy who had started it all, now a regular fixture at her concerts, became her unofficial helper. He'd greet newcomers, make sure everyone had enough blankets, and even hand out cookies someone had baked. One night, after the music ended and the crowd began to disperse, he shyly approached her holding a stuffed bear. "I want you to have this," he said, thrusting it toward her. "It makes me feel safe when I'm scared, and your music makes me feel the same way." Her throat tightened as she accepted the gift, unsure of what to say. All she could manage was a quiet, "Thank you." But inside her heart swelled with gratitude. These people, this town, they weren't intruding on her solitude. They were filling it with connection. And through their presence, she began to see her music in a new light. It wasn't just about finishing Winter Reverie for her grandmother anymore. It was about creating something that could bring people together, even if only for a few fleeting moments each night. As the weeks rolled on, the woman found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, she was thrilled by the growing connection with her audience. Their laughter, their tears, the way they leaned in closer, as if afraid to miss a single note. It all made her feel like she was part of something bigger than herself. But on the other hand, there was still that nagging voice in the back of her mind. The piece wasn't finished yet. No matter how much progress she made during the day, no matter how many nights she spent hunched over the piano, the final section of Winter Reverie remained elusive. One evening, after another lively gathering outside her cabin, she decided to take a break. The snow had stopped falling for the first time in days, and the air felt crisp and inviting. Wrapping herself in a thick scarf and gloves, she stepped outside, leaving behind the warmth of the fire and the chatter of her newfound friends. She needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out why this last stretch of music felt so impossible to complete. The woods behind her cabin were quiet, save for the occasional crunch of snow beneath her boots. Moonlight filtered through the bare branches above, casting long shadows across the ground. It was peaceful here, far from the distractions of daily life. As she walked deeper into the forest, her thoughts drifted back to her grandmother. What would she have done? How had she faced the same creative block all those years ago? Lost in thought, she almost missed it. A small, weathered wooden box half buried in the snow at the base of an ancient oak tree. Curious, she knelt down and brushed away the frost covering it. The box looked old, its surface scratched and faded, but when she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a folded letter, written in her grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, scanning the words scrawled across the page. It was addressed to her, not recently, but years ago, long before her grandmother passed away. In the letter, her grandmother spoke openly about her own struggles with finishing Winter Reverie. She admitted that some parts of the piece had never felt quite right, no matter how hard she tried. "Music isn't meant to be perfect," she wrote. "Sometimes the beauty lies in the imperfections, in the spaces where we let go and trust the listener to find their own meaning." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she read the words over and over again. This was more than just advice. It was permission to stop chasing perfection and start embracing the process. Her grandmother hadn't left the piece unfinished because she gave up. She had done it because she understood that not everything needs tying up neatly. Life itself was messy, unpredictable, and beautiful, precisely because of its flaws. With the letter clutched tightly in her hand, she stood up and looked around at the silent snow-covered forest. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of clarity. Finishing Winter Reverie wasn't about creating something flawless. It was about honoring the spirit of the music, the memories it carried, and the people it touched. And maybe, just maybe, that meant leaving room for interpretation, for listeners to hear what they needed to hear. When she returned home, the cabin felt different somehow. Warmer, lighter. The stuffed bear the boy had given her sat on the corner of the piano, watching over her like a silent guardian. She smiled faintly as she placed the letter carefully on the shelf above the keys. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would sit down and write the final notes, not to fix what was broken, but to celebrate what already existed. The night of the winter solstice finally arrived, and the town buzzed with excitement. It wasn't just any ordinary evening. It was special, marked by tradition and anticipation. Everyone knew something big was about to happen at the woman's cabin. Word had spread quickly. She was going to play Winter Reverie in its entirety for the first time. People didn't know what to expect, but they came anyway, drawn by the promise of magic that seemed to hang in the frosty air. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the crowd began to gather outside her home. Families brought blankets to sit on, thermoses filled with hot cocoa, and lanterns that cast a soft golden glow against the snow. The boy who had started it all stood near the front, clutching his stuffed bear tightly, his cheeks pink from the cold. Even those who rarely ventured out in winter, like the elderly couple down the lane or the reclusive artist who lived on the edge of town, showed up, curious to be part of whatever was unfolding. Inside, the woman moved quietly, preparing for the performance. Her heart raced as she lit candles around the room, their flickering light reflecting off the polished surface of the piano. She glanced at the sheet music resting on the stand, now complete with her handwritten additions. The final section wasn't perfect, not in the technical sense, but it felt right, a blend of her grandmother's original vision and her own emotional journey over the past few weeks. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped outside. The sight before her took her breath away. Dozens of people were gathered, their faces illuminated by candlelight, their eyes full of expectation. For a moment, she froze, overwhelmed by the sheer number of them. These weren't strangers anymore. They were neighbors, friends, even family in a way. Each person carried a piece of the story that had brought her here tonight. She swallowed, hard, forcing herself to smile as she welcomed them inside. The cabin was too small to fit everyone, so most stayed outside, huddled together under blankets as she began to play. The opening notes of Winter Reverie floated into the night, delicate and haunting, like the first flakes of snow falling from the sky. Silence fell over the crowd as the melody unfolded, weaving through moments of joy, longing, and quiet, reflection. Every note carried weight, the weight of memories, of shared experiences, of lives intertwined. When she reached the final section, the part she had written after finding her grandmother's letter, the music shifted. It became softer, more intimate, as if inviting listeners to lean in closer. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others held their loved ones tighter, feeling the emotion in every chord. By the time the last note faded into the stillness, no one moved. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause, suspended in the beauty of what they had just witnessed. And then, applause erupted, loud, heartfelt, and unrelenting. People cheered, clapped, and even cried, unable to contain the emotions stirred within them. The boy ran up to her, beaming, and threw his arms around her waist. "That was amazing!" he exclaimed, his voice breaking through the noise. Others followed suit, thanking her, congratulating her, telling her how much the music meant to them. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not as someone living on the fringes of the town, but as an integral thread in its fabric. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to everyone who had listened, supported, and believed in her along the way. As she looked out at the sea of smiling faces bathed in candlelight, she realized something profound. The music had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had warmed hearts, bridged gaps, and reminded everyone of the beauty found in connection, even in the coldest of winters. The winter solstice concert marked a turning point, not just for the woman, but for the entire town. Something had shifted. That night, something intangible yet powerful. The music had done more than fill the silence. It had stitched people together, creating bonds where none had existed before. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other now exchanged warm greetings on snowy mornings. Families started hosting potluck dinners, inviting others to share stories and laughter over steaming plates of food. And at the center of it all was the woman and her piano, a beacon of warmth in the heart of the season. Encouraged by the overwhelming response, she began composing new pieces, drawing inspiration from the people around her. There was a lively tune inspired by the laughter of children sledding down the hill near her cabin. A slow, reflective melody came from watching an elderly man feed birds outside his window every morning. Even the bustling energy of the weekly market found its way into her music, captured in bright, rhythmic chords that made listeners tap their feet. Each song told a story, not just of her own life, but of the community she had grown to love. Her music soon found its way beyond the cozy gatherings at her cabin. Local radio stations began playing recordings of her performances, and word spread to neighboring towns. People traveled from miles away to experience the magic of her melodies firsthand. On weekends, her little home became a hub of activity, with visitors bringing instruments of their own to join in. Someone would bring a guitar, another a violin, and together they'd create harmonies that echoed through the snowy hills. It wasn't about perfection. It was about connection, about making something beautiful out of shared moments. Years passed, and the boy who had first knocked on her door grew into a young man with a passion for music of his own. He often joined her during concerts, playing alongside her with the same enthusiasm he'd shown as a child. Together, they performed duets that blended her classical style with his modern flair, bridging generations and genres. The stuffed bear he had given her still sat proudly on the piano, a silent witness to how far they'd come. Through it all, Winter Reverie remained a centerpiece of every performance. It was more than just a song now. It was a tradition, a reminder of where it all began. Every December, as the first snowflakes drifted down, the town gathered once more to hear her play it. Families brought blankets, friends shared thermoses of hot cocoa, and the air buzzed with anticipation. For many, it had become an annual ritual, a moment to pause and reflect on the year gone by while looking forward to new beginnings. As she played the final notes of Winter Reverie one such evening, surrounded by familiar faces glowing in candlelight, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Her journey hadn't been easy. There had been doubts, struggles, and moments when she wondered if she was good enough. But through the support of her community, she had discovered something far greater than success, purpose. Her music wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever listened, cried, or smiled because of it. When the last note faded into the stillness, the crowd erupted into applause, just as they always did. But this time, she noticed something different. Among the cheers and clapping, she saw tears streaming down faces, young and old alike. In that moment, she understood the true legacy of her grandmother's unfinished piece. It wasn't about completing it perfectly. It was about keeping the spirit alive, passing it on to future generations so they too could find comfort and joy in its notes. And so, year after year, the tradition continued. The woman played, the town listened, and the music wove its way into the fabric of their lives, binding them together under the spell of winter's enchantment. Through every snowfall, every gathering, and every heartfelt melody, Winter Reverie lived on, a testament to the power of music, memory, and human connection.